thank you to Minds and Money for inviting us to have another quarterly 5 at 5. It has been a flurry of activity here in the United States from a political point of view, represented here 4 American projects, 3 in lithium, 1 in nickel, represented in 4 states, Nevada, North Carolina, Minnesota, and Michigan. And in the case of Piedmont, there's also, outside of the United States, Ghana and Quebec, which is to some degree of relevance as well as friendly countries, which might receive some of the government support that has recently been implemented. Has actually been a fair bit of legislation enacted in the United States, and a lot of it is not well understood, and in my opinion, it's actually quite underhyped. What's in train and what we're all trying to wrap our heads around, and will become clearer over the next weeks and months, is that there is some very substantial financial support, in particular on the supply side, rather than just demand-driven, EV subsidies, in support of battery production and also critical minerals processing that these 4 companies, here represent. The participants here, Emily Hersh from Luna Lithium, early stage, in Nevada. Todd Malan represents Talon Metals, which is in nickel, further down the exploration and development train. And then James Calaway of ioneer and Piedmont, are quite advanced lithium development stories. Both have publicly announced applications for loans from the Department of Energy, and both companies have signed meaningful offtakes with Tesla, Ford, and Toyota across, those 2 companies. And I want to start this discussion first with Emily, who, before starting Luna Lithium about a year ago, ran a podcast and kept us all informed throughout the pandemic, very much focused on these issues. The Minerals Manhattan Project was a podcast. You could describe what you were advocating for, but you've been busy, putting your money and your time, where your mouth was in developing an early stage, resource projects. So if you could just talk, Emily, I guess, what were you advocating for, how things have evolved, since then, and what you see in the legislation that's passed that can help a company at your stage of development, advance maybe faster than is the typical trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good morning, Howard, and thank you, Minds and Money, for including me on this exciting panel. It's definitely really exciting as a U.S. native who's recently returned to my home country to do mineral exploration, to see lithium and to see battery materials and the process by which they're mined from the earth and transformed into the technology-ready chemicals that we need to build batteries. It's very exciting to see that go from kind of a fringe topic where somebody doing a podcast from their closet during a pandemic is sort of one of the louder voices in it, to see this going all the way up to Congress and see it be consistently front page news in the New York Times, in the Financial Times, in the Wall Street Journal. And so it's definitely exciting times. And even I, who have advocated strongly for the need for U.S. domestic critical mineral supply chains, I'm surprised at the pace at which, or the speed with which, this has come about. But more so than that, and from an early stage company perspective, I think that the mining narrative, or the presentation of the necessity of U.S. domestic mining for things like lithium or nickel in the Inflation Reduction Act, it does, besides the financial and besides the economics that Howard, I think you were alluding to, and I'm sure we'll talk about on this panel, this really, I think, nails down the fact that lithium ion batteries powering electric vehicles are the incumbent technology that we are seeing in the car industry today. And that this is a real step that the US has decided to put a stronger foot in front of being a leader in the future of energy space. So the impetus for calling my podcast the Minerals Manhattan Project and talking about the need to understand the role of minerals in the battery supply chain in the United States came from a sort of a call to action, if you will, that we need to get serious, that the future of energy is electrification, and the future of energy being electrification means that the roots or the power of, from a geopolitical standpoint, of the actors who will matter in the future of this energy shifting paradigm are the ones who control these supply chains and are the ones who control these capabilities to make this energy. And for the United States' standpoint, I was calling for the US to take a leadership role. And so it's very pleasant to see that that has happened. And I think that we're in a position where the lithium ion battery and domestic supply chains and some domestic mining to achieve these goals is becoming inevitable, right? It's not an if, but it's a when. But this bill and these sort of actors that you see up here, we're the people who have the responsibility to push for when and push for how this happens. And I think that switching from that kind of fringe commentary to the idea that this is mainstream, this is happening now, how do we do it quickly and how do we do it responsibly is a exciting time to be alive.
All right. That sounds great. And I'm going to take your call to action and call up two slides that Todd Malan very nicely put together, because these are kind of like the nuts and bolts and meat of, again, what I consider to be not well understood and underhyped, but extremely meaningful. Large sums of money are going to be made available to American and friendly country resource projects. So I covered this in a recent podcast with John Miller of Cowen on Rockstock channel. I'd encourage you to kind of look at that at some point. But why don't you, Todd, go through these two slides and then we'll carry on from there.
So you have the bipartisan infrastructure law now that has $3.6 billion for battery mineral processing in the United States. And we're going to start to see some of the funding priorities of the administration come out this fall because half of that money will be awarded in the fall. And then, there was extraordinary funding added to the Ukraine supplemental funding bill this spring that put money into the Department of Defense's coffers for the Defense Production Act, specifically targeted at the battery supply chain. And then you see everything that we can go over in the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that the thing that you have to conclude, and I've been, in Washington for 30 years and doing critical minerals work for 12 to 15, is that there's a clear bipartisan consensus that leaders in the United States are making the battery supply chain a priority, and they want to decouple from China. That's the headline across all of these pieces of legislation. And if you only look at the Inflation Reduction Act, lots of people have spent time on basically the EV support for individual consumers and the requirements that are in that provision that stipulate that the battery minerals have to be sourced from the United States or from a free trade agreement country or from battery minerals that have been recycled in North America. And I think a lot of people are just focused on how hard that's going to be and the fact that we don't have as many sources of supply within those countries. I take a much, more positive view of this. I think that because of the other restrictions, the fact that there's a limitation on the subsidy for high income individuals. So there's an income qualification, and then there's also a price limitation on there. It's already a fairly limited scope of cars that will be able to receive the incentive. But what it does do, and people leave out this, is provide really meaningful resources to project developers in the United States. And these credits are really only available to projects in the United States, like the Tamarack project or the other panelist projects in the United States that are basically tax credits. So these tax credits have previously been really only targeted at renewable energy projects, but now critical mineral processing is included in both of the incentives. So there's the 48C Advanced Energy Project Credit, and that's an extension of an existing project that now reads in critical mineral processing operations and recycling into the scope of that credit. And that is a 30% of the potential cost of a project to be included as a credit. And I think that will make a meaningful contribution to the projects that apply for that credit and are awarded that credit. And there's going to be lots of regulations that still have to be executed for each of these two credits. But then on 45X, this is a brand new credit. Nobody really fully understands how it's going to be implemented, but it gives a 10% production cost tax credit to a wide degree of renewable energy producers or manufacturers of renewable energy machinery, as well as production of battery grade materials. So I think there's a real push from Senator Manchin to do things domestically or with allies and basically decouple to the greatest extent possible from the Chinese dominated supply chain. But he also gives resources to be able to do it. So it's not just telling people thou shalt, produce in the United States, but also provides that infrastructure and that support to be able to move the ball forward. There are a couple other things in the bill that I think are less headline grabbing, but also important to keep in mind. There's another contribution of $500 million to the Defense Production Act, Title III funding. So that's over $1 billion that's available to both mines and battery processing and recycling, as stipulated in the Defense Production Act Title III program. There's a focus in the bill around environmental justice initiatives. And what that means is making sure that the money in the bill goes to communities that have previously perhaps caught the environmental costs of some developments, and for projects that locate in areas that actually qualify as areas that have been affected disproportionately by fossil fuel development and other things. There's other resources there. And I think that's very important for people that are developing projects to think about some of that location choices you may have. You can't, move the geology, but you may be able to move and choose where the processing is. DOE loan program got a big additional funding in this bill that again can finance projects in the United States. Then there's a new green bank that is available for funding. And then finally, there's significant funding added to the ability of the federal government to prioritize the permitting process under Fast 41, which is a little known group of people within the White House that actually focus on coordinating complex permitting processes within the federal government and try to keep everything on schedule and moving forward at pace. It's actually something that I think is quite positive. It exists in law now, but no mining companies have yet taken advantage of it and actually sought Fast 41 support. So there's a lot in this bill. There's a lot in the other bills that I mentioned that are very positive for the sector. And, I really don't think there's been a better time to be developing a mineral project in the United States since before the Second World War.
Todd, thank you. That was a great summary. There's a lot of information in that, and this is the second of many kind of discussions we plan to have on this. Just by way of background, I forgot to introduce all of your background, Todd. So you were at Rio Tinto doing government affairs for much of those 12 years, recently joined Talon about a year ago. Rio Tinto is a partner, on the Talon project. But prior to that, you were working, for Goldman Sachs. And as you described it to me, you were, helping Lloyd Langfein, back in the day of the Volcker rule, after the, the global financial crisis. So you certainly know your way around Washington, D.C. But Goldman is a banker appointed that ioneer has appointed. So you've been working, pretty closely, James, with them. As we did a podcast with you in 2019. I told you this morning, I was re-listening to it. You keynoted the Benchmark Minerals event, and they just had another event, 3 years later after the pandemic. And there's been a marked shift from, what we were talking about then and what you were like envisioning and suggesting should happen is now kind of happening. So if you could just give us, the lay of the land, as you see it, in DC, and maybe you could talk a little bit specifically because your issues are, are very particular that you're dealing with. But I'm curious, you've signed 3 offtakes, with Ford, Toyota, and EcoPro. Is that a requirement, for the Department of Energy loan? So you're really deep in the weeds of and advanced in those dialogues, and hopefully we'll get, a loan.
Well, thank you very much, and appreciate being with all of you, and thank you for including me. I like everyone else on this panel is very excited about all the things that Todd just eloquently described. You start looking at the scale of the resources that have been are being deployed, and it's for the first time it's commensurate with the needs. I remember going to see the Department of Defense. I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. They had this fund, and I went to the Pentagon. And I walked through these halls. I gave my cell phone up into a locker and sat down with these 3 guys, and they're really nice guys, and they really were determined to help the lithium sector. And we had this long conversation. At the end, I said, "Well, how much money do you have?" And they said, "Well, we have appropriated $45 million, but about 2/3 of that is committed to other things." And I looked at them. I just didn't know what else to do. I said, "Guys, I hate to tell you, but the scales that you're talking about are irrelevant to me. They don't mean anything to me. $10 million, $5 million, it's a drop in the bucket. Now, if you're doing research, great. But if you're trying to build $1 billion+ mine, it's irrelevant." And I think that what's so exciting is that all of a sudden we find ourselves in the land of plentiful. But I start thinking about the implications of a 30% investment tax credit. You can, most people don't think about this, but I know you do, Todd. It converts, in my mind. I start thinking about going and doing tax equity financings that have been critical to the development of renewable energy around the United States. It's an enormous opportunity to generate equity. It's convoluted for most people, but it is very important. And of course, the production credit too. It's a little more difficult to convert it because it's a risk type position of revenue. But boy, when you start talking about an investment credit, you're going to make those investments, and so they're monetizable. So I think these are fantastic things. And I would be remiss to not mention about the extraordinary amount of money that's now available in the Department of Energy. And of all the agencies, the Loan Production Group has been more forward-leaning with significant resources in the last year than anybody else. That's the good news, and certainly their available funds are extraordinary at this point. And they were, by the way, they're pretty extraordinary before this IRA bill too. So it's been both times. But the thing I'd caution everybody about is that they act, at least our experience over the last year and a half working with them, and I'm sure that Piedmont's would be the similar, is they act very much like a big commercial bank. Okay, this idea that there's easy money coming out of the Department of Energy is just not an accurate perspective. They're very sensitive to the Solyndra case. They're very sensitive to making big mistakes. Now, with that being said, if you can get through their multi-stage process and you can actually get to an agreed structure, the terms of that capital will be very advantageous to your capital structure. It has various characteristics. One is, of course, the tenor is good. So, a lot of times when you're having a startup operation, commercial banks are going to want to squeeze you on the tenor, or have hurdles where you're going along, and then they want to do a reval, and you're all of a sudden in trouble. Where they're giving quality, I think you can expect sort of 10-year type tenors for good projects that have that kind of, with the support ratios, which is good. And then, of course, the interest rates are going to be quite favorable relative to what you could expect in a commercial syndicate. So I think this is good, but I do want everyone to know that it's a year and a half of really hard work to get to the finish line with those guys. It's not something you walk in and say, hey, I'd like to have it, because the way that process works, Howard, is there's a multi-phase period. It's sort of their internal review, okay, where their own team, which they have about 180 or 200 people there, and they're all basically came out of commercial banks, as far as I can tell. So it's a very commercially oriented discussion. Those guys will do their internal reviews, and that's multi-staged. And then after you get through that, that you're actually really into potentially getting some resources when you go into the formal phase. And that's where it gets expensive, because now all of a sudden you're paying for their external consultants and your team to really do a deep dive evaluation, technically, financially, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, just like you would do with a big syndicate bank. That's really what it's like. But you're paying for both sides of that conversation. And then that you've made it through when you get a firm term sheet. So it's a very detailed term sheet that tells you, okay, we've come to an agreement. And then it's sort of a legal process after that to try to document it up and get it ready to be executed. And it'll have CPs. So, it will have CPs that allow you to, they'll
condition
say,
precedent.
Conditions precedent. Like, for instance, that, you get a final, at least a class 2 cost estimate. So you're going to have a very high quality cost estimate from a reliable source. You're going to have, you're going to have to, by the way, take into account Davis-Bacon. So, count that one in. Don't forget about Davis-Bacon, because they're going to make you use Davis-Bacon in construction. They're going to require, forward-leaning inflationary factors they're going to have to put in there. So there's a lot of things that go into these things in reality. But but look, it's there. I mean, it's incredible that it's there, and I'm excited about that. The other challenge that we all face is that in the end, all of these resources, all those different ones, are all ultimately tied to getting a permitted mine. Okay, nobody's getting any of this money until they have a permitted mine. I mean, you might get a little research money, from some source, but the big money isn't flowing until you have a permitted mine. And if you're dealing, with the federal government in public lands, that's a hell of a thing. I mean, and in general, it's a hell of a thing, because we have a dysfunctional permitting process. And you can say whatever you want about it. It's totally dysfunctional, because there's too many cooks in the kitchen, and by the way, it's very difficult to get economic considerations factored into the permit. So if you bring it up, it's like, well, we don't deal with economic matters. We deal with flowers, or we deal with Indian affairs, or we deal with this, or we deal with that. But when you ever bring up, say, hey, we have a climate catastrophe here, We need to draw down emissions as fast as we can to save the planet. And oh, by the way, your delays are costing us hundreds of millions of dollars in cost, but both internal costs as well as inflationary impacts. It's just like a blank stare. It's like, no, knock, knock, who's there? Nobody's home. And I think that this is the boogaboo, if you will, of this whole discussion. Is the government on one hand is sending very strong signals, as Todd eloquently explained, that we want to see this, but their own apparatus is deeply dysfunctional in trying to actually get it done and costing American industry. The cost of building a mine in the United States is becoming extraordinarily high relative to the world. And this is something that we've got to address if we want to have what we're all talking about.
And I do want to address permitting. I want to focus on all the good things that are in the bill, and then talk about like what is still to be discussed, because Manchin, by September 30th, we'll see what the compromise on the permitting reform are. And permitting in particular is very relevant for you, James and Emily in Nevada, who are operating on federal land. It's less relevant where you're on private land. Permitting is difficult everywhere, but if you're part of the NEPA process, right, which federal land is, that is its own kind of kettle of fish. But in Minnesota, and Michigan, where Talon operates, and in North Carolina, where Piedmont operates, they're not in the NEPA process, but they confront other local challenges, which, if permitting has federal support, right, it'll spill over into the state areas. But let's deal with that in a minute. But just
Sure.
Austin, as you're digesting all the news that Todd, kind of talked about, how do you see this playing out? For Piedmont, not only in North Carolina, but there are friendly Quebec, who's considered a domestic source from the Pentagon's point of view, and then even Ghana, where we used to have the Overseas Private Investment Corp. There's now called, I think, the Development Credit Corp. So we used to loan money to lesser developed countries, and Ghana kind of fits in that, and maybe have some aid available for that as well.
Holy smokes. Well, first, Howard, thanks for having me. Minds and Money, thanks for having me. Great group of panelists here. I've had the opportunity to spend time with each of you previously, and it is fun to kind of go through this. And I'll first start with the Inflation Reduction Act and its impact. And it really is surprising to me where we've come from, because if you look back over the last 15 years, 2009, we had the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Was a $3.5 billion investment that went across, and it was matching grants, so it was a little bit different than what we have today. When the bipartisan infrastructure law came out in May, another $3.5 billion funding mechanism for the critical minerals and battery supply chain. So I was a little disappointed in that, because I was hearing the CHIPS Act at that point was over $50 billion in investments that were going into. The LiBridge effort was an effort that was taking a measure from different participants in the battery supply chain looking for it. And it was apparent that some of that information was funneling back to Congress. So when the Inflation Reduction Act started getting leaked out in July, and before it was passed, it was really surprising, the scale, because that's what I find fascinating, because it really, when you start thinking about how some of these production tax credits and investment credits will play into the support for the industry, we're talking about investments that are probably on the order of $100 billion that will flow back and be supportive to the development of this industry. We've had ARPA, DARPA, small amounts for investments. Emily referenced the Mineral Manhattan Project, and if you asked her what the reason the Manhattan Project was there, it was pretty unique, because it tied into the lithium industry. If you look back to the atomic weapons program after World War II and developing that, it was tied to developing a lithium industry in the early 1950s here in the United States. And so standing up a critical minerals industry today is really a hard lift. It's whether it's permitting reform, the investment, The timeline for doing it, it's significant. The United States has been a leader in the critical minerals industry for years and years and years. The battery supply chain. You look at what UT Austin, MIT did back in the 80s to develop this battery industry. It's really pretty significant for us here in North Carolina. Permitting is a challenge because we do have a lot of it on the state level. But we're excited because of what these investments will mean to our project. We're going to announce later this week a second plant that's a conversion plant, which will rely on resources from outside of the country. Our joint venture in Quebec, or Ghana material, as a supply source for that, and it'll be eligible for these credits as well. So those kind of things will really jumpstart this industry. And as one of the other panelists was referencing, lithium ion has become the incumbent technology, and it's really because automakers decided it had the energy density to transform their transportation industry and also do the things we need to provide a better and safer climate for our future generations. And that's really the big step, is that we're going to have a battery supply chain here. We won't be able to supply 100% of our needs, but having independence away from China, it's apparent that Congress took a lot of measured ideas, put those into place, and put them in place in a way that really will allow for action to take place. That's why if you look at the things that we did, I think 13 years ago with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, it really wasn't the stimulus needed. Now we have the stimulus there that I think you'll see that action taking place. You've seen a lot of announcements being made from battery makers installing plants here so that they can get a portion of the component piece, but you'll see a lot of conversion and other development activity taking place going forward. I think those are probably the things I wanted to touch on, Howard, and I can get into permitting as you need, but I really wanted to describe what the government action today really is a significant step forward.
Permitting could be like an extremely long topic, so I don't want to spend too much of our like 25 minutes kind of discussing that, but I want to touch on it in this way. All of these, I've noticed very much, like all of these supports have been, they've redefined a lot of existing laws and made them applicable to kind of like the processing of critical minerals. But like alone, the LPO, even Piedmont, right? Like if you're crushing rock, if you concentrate the rock, that's okay. That's processed. They could give you money for that. But if you're the mining portion, and this is also applies to kind of Lithium Americas, it may apply to you, James, the actual digging of the dirt needs to be disaggregated from the overall capital cost. Like that won't be funded, right? So that reflects like this perception like mining still has a significant PR problem, right? Like putting shovels in the ground, we can't lend to that. Whereas in Quebec, you have flow through financing, right? They encourage drilling, right? Like they have all the, so Emily, as a millennial woman, now living in central Nevada, okay, you're not working for Google, or social media, whatever, but like a lot of your brethren, ilk, are protesting on the other side. So how do we get more Emilys, right? And you think like
Howard, you should be careful what you ask for. I don't know if that more Emilys is what the general population is after. No,
like
look,
Joe Biden's a regular Joe, right? Like, so mining, you would think, is a natural kind of constituency that he should be supporting, in addition to chemical manufacturing. So if you're watching the political weight of the U.S. government, and it's helping change the narrative, and then the Fords and the GM are going to follow, right? So how do we get them to support mining?
listen, Howard, I think we're moving in the right direction, and the depth with which anti-mining sentiment is ingrained in a large percentage of the population, not just in the US, but globally, and the depth with which this idea that mining or mineral extraction is a thing of the past, is a thing, you know, quite literally almost every childhood movie that I grew up with had the mining guys as the bad guys, right? And you don't undo, or you don't shift that narrative with one, you know, slash of a government pen. And one of the sort of the notes that I've been taking down during this conversation is sort of the idea that what I see as overwhelmingly positive in this bill was that it wasn't bipartisan, right? That this was a Democrat-led, Democrat-pushed bill. And what that tells me is that the spirit of, or the goals that are outlined within this bill are going to last through a couple political cycles, because realistically, that is what we need to change the narrative. You know, unfortunately, you know, I can't just get on a podcast and tell my, I guess my millennial brethren that, you know, your stuff, it comes from a mine. It takes engagement, and engagement means over time having conversations, talking about things, driving the narrative, but also taking the time to listen to folks who think differently, and understanding the positions that the roots of and the causes of anti-mining sentiment, or why people, and there's, you and I have discussed this in the past, Howard, but there are very different kinds of anti-mining sentiment that come from different groups of people. You know, on one hand, you have local issues, right? And I'll hat tip my neighbors ioneer that, you know, I've seen them do for years extremely on the ground communication and interaction with their local community, who have questions about dust, or questions about water use, or questions about these very local impacts that this project will have. And those can be addressed in one manner. And on the other hand, or in a different manner, you have folks who, you know, identify with a social persuasion that has decided that mining is bad, that mining is not an environmental process, that it's dirty, that it's, and engaging with, or the method with which you can communicate with that group is a very different conversation that needs to be had on a very different level. And then a third group that is very important to address when talking about how to build sustainable mining in this country are historic issues of social justice that are tied up within the construction of large mining projects, not just in the US, but worldwide in history, right? You've got you know, colonialism and mining went hand in hand in large portions of the world. And so finding the way to engage with and over time continuously communicate with those three different groups, I think is essential to, you know, I don't think it's going to cause, you know, 50 more Emilys to pop up. And like I said, that's probably a good thing. But I do think it opens ears, and it opens conversations, and it helps break down some stereotypes, and helps maybe the folks on the other side of the stereotypes understand why it exists and work to kind of change that. And so I think we're moving in the right direction, but I do think a engagement-based constructive approach to understanding and moving forward is more necessary now in this time where the battery supply chain is mainstream than, you know, me jumping up on a stage and being like, your phone, it's full of stuff from a mine. I think people kind of are getting that, but understanding how to get to an outcome that everybody is in favor of is the next challenge that we face.
Howard, can I just add on to that?
Sure.
I completely agree with what Emily outlined here. And, you know, I think we're all carrying a very heavy burden of the legacy of bad actions in the mining sector over a long period of time. But let's also face up to the fact that large projects that disturb or change somebody's neighborhood, whether it's solar, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's a new gigafactory, people are concerned about that, and that's okay. You know, I mean, I think that's natural. The question is, how do you address it? How do you listen to the community? How do you take on board things that you can change and try to address those things so people feel like they're being heard and that they can then also start to think about the benefits of a new solar plant or a new hydrogen plant that is going to help us deal with the global existential problem of climate change. And that's the thing that I think in terms of information and education, what Emily said is exactly right. There's only so much we can do as companies. But if the president of the United States is going to stop and say, wait a second, let's talk about critical minerals and stop talking about yes or no, but move the conversation to how and where. I think that's the thing that is really stark for me, is that you have so much attention in Congress, so much focus by the president talking about, okay, we absolutely need this stuff, folks. It's gotta happen. How do we want to do it? We want to do it with good tribal consultation and tribal involvement, and hopefully economic benefit sharing from the projects to the community, including tribes. We want to make sure we protect the environment, that we protect water, we protect the air, and you got to answer how you're going to do that. So this whole environment is not only about resources and support that's financial, but it's also the credentialization of leaders in America saying, we have to deal with climate change. We have to have an energy transition. We have to decouple from China and the reliance on China and Russia for these minerals. Let's talk about how we're going to do it. And I think that's a really important opportunity for companies like the ones on this call, and for the National Mining Association and other entities to say, let's join that conversation.
Yeah, Howard, that, when you talk about mining, and that, Todd was referencing the Legacy Act, that's why I'm so excited we're building the industry here in the United States, because the United States will take the right steps for ensuring that we engage, because we have a democratic constitution where you get involvement from all people. And so you have, whether it be indigenous tribes that are near a project, local communities, we want to provide an economic benefit to those people. We want to participate in things that reduce climate change or improve our climate. We want to have high paying, safe jobs for our workers. We're not moving into a community and bringing in a bunch of people. We're hiring people in our community. So that's important to lifting up the entire thing and doing it in a manner that really is. And so Emily was referencing the fact that administrations have changed and policies have changed around democratic processes. It is exciting that this is passed in a Democratic Congress, and we can expect that it probably will last going forward. That's one of the challenges we've had over the last 15 years, is the fact that the differences that have occurred in administrations has caused so much change that there is an investment or a negative perception of what the investment for a project might be. I look at that stability that we have as being a very big positive. We still have the challenge that the wording in the Inflation Reduction Act is extracted. It's not mined. If they would have used mined, it might have been a little more pleasantly changed that perception, because everyone associates mining as being a bad thing. I find it fascinating for those of you who watch the Tour de France. They have a huge mine that's on about the 8th day of the Tour de France, and it stretches for over 2 miles long. And it's right in the backdrop of a bicycle race. And that's really, it's eye-opening to me that's not ever mentioned, because they coexist very politely in that area. And it's one that coexistence can happen everywhere. It happens in Canada. It can happen in all these projects. So exciting for me as we move forward and get mining to a place that your regular Joe can say, hey, I'm happy that we're building a mining industry here in the United States.
James, I want to bring you in as well. I was just thinking that, like, at the Fish and Wildlife Service, you could probably use one Emily and one person from Jigar Shah's team, right? So an economic, right, and someone, so it's not kind of knock who's there. I mean, I'm half joking or using your words there, But
No,
it is in America, you could have a very small segment, right, of resistance, right? And in the case of North Carolina or in the case of Minnesota, it could just be a very small, either not in my backyard or someone who falls in love with a flower that, you know, creates uncertainty and creates hundreds of millions of dollars of delays as you're talking about it, and cancels projects. So how do you,
yeah. Well,
you
let
know,
me,
you can have all the engagement you want. How do you,
Yeah.
you know, have logic prevail?
Emily, thank you for noting our team's efforts over the years and working out there in our local areas. You know, sort of, because we're running towards the end, I kind of look at it this way, that the government says that all of them, regardless of your affiliation, they all say we want to have responsible mining in America. Okay, but one of the challenges is, what do they mean by that? Okay, so you know that there's not a particularly great definition of what gets you over the hurdle. I do think that all the things that have been brought up here about engagement with your community, absolutely, and certainly in the case of lithium, where we tend to be in fairly super evaporitic environments, water is unbelievably important, and taking care of water and water tables and everything else is super, super important. I certainly think that to different degrees, but everybody has to take into account tribal issues and make sure that they're you know, really not just consulting in a check the box way, but really looking at how this can work for them as well as for the local communities. I mean, it's very, very important stuff. And there's a whole bunch of other things that, you know, we need to make sure we do. I ideally don't have tailings dams and, you know, a variety of other things. But here's the thing that I just don't know how to deal with is when you have the Endangered Species Act. Okay, the Endangered Species Act is set up to protect endangered species, but it also has been structured so that it's a field day for those that want to stop all development, period. It's like it's so easy to find a way to throw a wrench into, you know, huge projects and huge efforts where they may not ever prevail in the end with stopping it because of it, but they can sure as hell drag you and drag you and drag you. And unfortunately, you know, you would like to think that all the environmental groups are looking at, you know, ESA, and they're saying, oh man, we want to work with the companies to make sure that we're very sensitive in taking care of the endangered species and broadly speaking. But there are a set of actors, okay, whose real job is to use it as a bludgeoning tool, okay, and who do not necessarily need to be linked to the truth or to science, but are really just using it as a legal method to slow you down and wear you down. And we have certainly seen that in certain actors that we've had to deal with, and they're some of the most egregious. And so I do think that there is a need for us to relook at this and, you know, how it is that we can have, you know, huge efforts. And by the way, one of the things that's really interesting I've experiencing, and I'm sure all of you have, is that the closer you get to being actually ready to go build something, okay, and these are massive projects, the burn rates that you have to sustain in order to actually have the work done to do it get higher and higher and higher, so that the burden on entrepreneurial companies accelerates very, very quickly. And so these guys, because their purpose is to stop you, they're really not. It's secondary, the issue of what they're using to do it. They're bludgeoning people, okay? And we need to stop this. I mean, there has got to be a relook at ESA and make sure that it's being handled appropriately and not being just used as a legal mechanism to stop everything. This has got to happen, okay? Because all of us are going to be impacted by this. You show me a project on federal lands where they don't have this problem, and I'll show you somebody who doesn't know yet what they're dealing with. So I think that this is an issue. There are people that are not acting in good faith here, okay? Their objective is to stop development, okay? And that is not a good use of people's time nor this industry. Now, look, with that being said, okay, you can beat them. Okay, you can beat them. We're about to beat them. Okay, but it is a very long and expensive process to beat them. And you have to factor that into sort of the timelines of expectation for U.S. production, because a lot of the best opportunities are on federal lands. Okay, so this is something that I don't want to leave it on a downer, because I'm super excited about where we are. I know we're going to get this project built, and the others are going to get built, but it takes fortitude, Howard.
That's not a negative note, because we do have, like, Manchin's, has a promise, right, from Pelosi and Schumer, and there's a continuing resolution September 30th. We're going to have, there's some guidelines out there. We don't know what it's going to take, but like Elon Musk was out there yesterday saying we need oil and gas for the next 30, 40 years, right? Like, so he's pushing back on, the very aggressive, there's some realism there. There's a support for nuclear that we haven't seen, in a while. Right. So Manchin, I think, largely gets it. And you have Tesla as partner of two of the companies on this panel. You have Ford is a partner, of yours. Sabanya is a partner of yours. And Sabanya, we had them on our podcast, talked about the good neighbor agreement that they have in Montana. So there's a lot of positive, things happening here. How do you think it's going to play out with Manchin and with major U.S. auto companies recognizing that, you need to localize, you need, for environmental reasons and supply chain security reasons, the political weight, is moving in a positive direction, but as it pertains to permitting and the reducing the ability of, Endangered Species Act, people stopping projects. How do you see it playing out?
I'm an optimist about it. Projects like the ones we've talked about today, I think we'll get there. And as James said, it takes a lot of work, and it should take a lot of work. I mean, we are disturbing the earth, and we have to be able to show that we can do that in a responsible way, that we can close the operation responsibly and then put up financial assurance and all of that. I think at the end of the day, the reason I'm positive, though, is because we have this new sort of focus and national impetus on addressing the climate change. The crisis of climate change requires inputs. You can't recycle what you don't have. So I think that hopefully, with a lot of effort by the auto sector, by leaders of both parties, by the mining sector, we can explain to people, A, that there is a necessity for these materials, and B, that we can do it responsibly and produce those ingredients while also protecting the environment and having people benefit economically as well. I think that's an important part of the equation.
I agree with you completely, and I do think we can do it. I just wish we'd have everybody aligning, and we wouldn't have these people messing around and slowing things down. But I do think you're right that there should be great optimism. I'm certainly very optimistic we'll get ours built.
I'm an engineer by training. I like to do things efficiently. When the government kind of looks in, gets understanding of kind of what this means for energy independence, our ability to convert a electron into a mile driven in whatever form that takes, and you see the efficiency that an electric motor brings to that equation, how it improves our ability to use resources more efficiently. That, to me, is what brings that optimism over to you. Say, holy cow, I'm able to drive my vehicle for a third of the cost to go from point A to point B than what I did 5 years ago. So I think that perception is kind of finally setting in across the chain, whether it be at the legislative spot, the general population. Everyone's seeing that, and you're kind of getting the benefit of that in our industry now. But it's a lot of heavy lifting, as James described. There is no easy path to get to the end, and because of that, we've got years ahead of us of heavy lifting.
And Emily, your Twitter description is of a cheerful pessimist.
I was about to say, in this instance, even the cheerful pessimist is optimistic that we're moving in a direction that will result in domestic mining. I do think that James has been in it so that hopefully it'll take me, 7 years instead of 15 to weave my way through the hydro permitting process where, he is right. There's a really interesting reality that the economics of your project do not matter to the people that you're talking about. And in order to even begin the consultation process with all of these groups, your cash burn goes way up with no certainty over when and if there's a light at the end of that tunnel. That said, I do think that the focus on, or this sort of idea that by focusing on timelines, or that by imposing tighter deadlines on these processes, that we'll be able to end bureaucratic hurdles, isn't the approach to bringing substantive changes that are long lasting and that are going to actually drive this result. So I'm paraphrasing from a Politico article, I think, that came out yesterday on that, but I do think that substantive changes in the permitting process is what we need. And I don't think that whipping timelines on the existing process that we have is going to drive those results. So still cheerful, long-term optimistic, but I do think that to echo Austin, this is the beginning of the next chapter. And those of us who have been working at this now for, decades, this is going to be an even heavier lift than getting people to start having this conversation at all.
Thank you, Emily, James, Austin, and Todd for a great discussion. And the wind's at our back with U.S. government really making a step function change. I think they've surpassed Europe in a number of ways, who seemed a little bit ahead on this topic a few years ago. And thank you, Andy, Thake, and the Minds and Money team for having us again. We'll do it again next quarter, and hopefully we'll have favorable permitting reform under Manchin, and we'll see what happens in the House and Senate, and read the political tea leaves, at that time. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Howard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Howard.
Bye-bye.